everybody. My name is James D. Fiore, and this is Blackballed. It is a special day kind of for me today on Blackballed because of the way that my guest today and I met. He was, it might be 2 years ago now, he might correct me. I was contacted by this gentleman who was writing a book on how weed legalization came to be in this country. And I thought it was a really first initial conversation that we had. It was interesting to me because, and we will discuss this very briefly because I just want to talk about his ideas for the book. I'm in his book because he interviewed me about working with the Liberal Party of Canada. I think it was like 6 years before they enacted legalization. It was long before Justin Trudeau was even prime minister. But I thought the book that he wrote was really important. And the reason, there was a few reasons why. The main reason, though, and this was what I thought of immediately when he contacted me, is because I had noticed that there were certain people, Jody Emery comes to mind, who was researching the insider favors, the insider information, whatever you want to call it, that there were just so many senators and former police officers and former politicians and all these people who seem to have a ground floor into the investment part of legalization. But then my guest today expanded it further than that. And his book is called Buzzkill, the corporatization of cannabis. I didn't put it up. Hold on, guys. I'm going to put up the picture because that's what a smart podcaster does. So, like I said, his book, now it's loading forever. All for a picture. This is the cover of his book, Buzzkill, the corporatization of cannabis. Please welcome to the show. His name is Michael DeVallaer. Michael, how are you, buddy? Sorry,
I'm fine, James. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. I blame Elon Musk for what's happening with my computer right now because I swear I'm clicking it the right time. It's good to see you. Thank you for coming. Listen, there aren't many books written about this subject, and I think that I was going to say you took your time. You, I think, did probably really thorough research as to not get sued for one thing, because there's a lot of powerful people that you sort of, talk about, let's just say, in this book. What made you want to write it? And do you get stoned yourself?
Well, you know what? I don't mean to be avoidant or anything, but I think whether or not I get stoned is kind of immaterial to the issue.
I was just kidding.
Certainly cannabis. So next question. Yeah. But to write the book, like I've been an advocate for cannabis law reform for about half a century now. I mean, I started pretty young, and the book has been probably a good 10 years in the research.
Okay.
And so I thought it was about time. I mean, I've written journal articles and I've contributed chapters to books, but to really tell the story, I think a book is the format that was needed. So, and the important point that I want to make right off the top is that it isn't pro or anti-cannabis use. It just tells the story of cannabis's journey from demonized street drug, we all remember those days, to now this glamorized corporate commodity that we have. And it's a fascinating story. And I think, in our interview, and I think it was about a couple years ago, you provided a really nice piece of it, given the direct contact you had with the Liberal Party at that time. So it's a fascinating story. It's not always a pretty one. It will shatter your faith in government and regulation of industry. It gets ugly.
I mentioned in the intro about all those people that had a ground floor entry point into the investment of legal. Was anyone ever asked a question about how these people got the information so quickly and whether or not it was considered inside information? Was there anyone that any request for an investigation, or was it all? Sometimes I find things are legal that shouldn't be legal. Was it one of those things?
That's a bit of a major theme of my life, is that when we look at drug problems, and I'll get back to your question in a second, but when we look at drug problems, if it's really our legal drug industries, alcohol and tobacco, that account for most drug-related harm, most drug-related deaths, and most drug-related costs to the economy. I mean, far more than all the illegal drugs combined. So you have to ask the question, what is the implication of that for cannabis making this transition from illegal to legal drug? And to answer your question, I think a lot of it was being kept that kind of stuff was being kept under the radar. Now, what we were being told, if we think back to that time in the years leading up, the Liberal Party of Canada's case, there were sort of two pieces to it. First of all, it was telling us that cannabis users, including our children, were buying their cannabis from dangerous organized crime figures. We heard gun runners, street gangs. Remember all that? Well, the academic evidence didn't support that at all. In fact, what's even more interesting is even the government's own intel told them that was not true. And I poured through annual reports from the Canadian Prosecution Service of Canada, the Criminal Intelligence Service of Canada. There was a report from the Department of Justice Canada, and they all came to the same conclusion, which is the role of organized crime in the illegal cannabis trade was negligible.
I don't know if this constitutes dangerous, but I had a weed dealer for 10 years who used to like ride his rollerblades in and out of traffic really quickly. So that was pretty helpful. But I'm actually surprised about that because I actually thought that one of the good reasons to legalize was to take away a revenue stream from organized crime. But you're saying that the evidence didn't wash with that.
No, it was, I mean, yes, there were a few bad players, but that was a very small, as I said, negligible piece of it. Most people who were involved in the cannabis trade were, I mean, apart from selling cannabis, were law-abiding people, not that different from most Canadians. And I cover that in a fair bit of detail in the book to tell that. But the piece now let's think about what was the other part of the Liberal Party's case for legalization. They were telling us we were going to have a regulated, law-abiding industry that would produce safe product of known integrity, and that they would pay taxes. Now, those are actually decent reasons for legalizing cannabis, but it didn't work out so well, and we can sort of circle back to that. But to get back to the other piece, what the Liberal Party was not telling us in all their pageantry around this was that a group of its elite members and their loyal servants in the bureaucracy were all jumping on the ship of cannabis legalization. They were investing in companies. They were joining the cannabis companies. And to help things along, I mean, there were several big cannabis industry players on the Liberal Party's board of directors. And then remember, we established a task force. And the job of the task force was to consult with experts and Canadians, and they make recommendations directly to cabinet about what this marijuana industry should look like. And well, guess what? Both the chair and the co-chair of that task force had pre-existing ties to the cannabis industry and even greater ambitions. So this whole thing, really was a little bit suspect from the beginning.
We talked today, and I will honor our conversation by maintaining the anonymity of a person. But when you told me that there were certain people that had ties to the investment part of this, I recalled being in a meeting with a few people, and one of those people were there, and they were the only one in the room that was expressing concerns. And to look at that in hindsight was very eye-opening for me, because then that person puts a little bit of of a buffer, I guess, between being suspected of like helping somebody out or whatever. Were you able to untie or explain how it was that all of these inner circle people got on the ground floor?
No. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that it happened. It's been well documented by a number of various journalists who sort of looked into the ties. And as you said, Jody Emery did a great job concentrating on all the former law officials, law enforcement officials that got involved in it. But how that process happened, that's all part of the sort of the backroom mystique. And we may never know how that happened. And the other thing that I think is interesting is the final report of that task force is still not publicly available.
Wow. In a way, it's the original Greenbelt scandal, right?
Oh,
I guess. Yeah. Sorry, that's a bad pun. There's also the question of politicians and their principles. This issue really exposed a lot of politicians as being ditherers. And like you mentioned the interviews that I did at the Liberal Convention in January 2012. So I interviewed Paul Martin, and he looked like a deer in headlights. He was like, I'm like, do you think it's time to have an adult conversation about this? And he's like, yes, yes, an adult conversation. Think is okay. I gotta go behind this curtain. Who was it? Stefan Dion was like, well, don't think that. I don't know. And then Justin Trudeau, which you mentioned. I interviewed him, and it was kind of a classic politician interview. He was like, I can see the argument that some would have because alcohol is legal, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember it word for word, and that. And then when he pivoted to the other side of the issue, because he was basically speaking out of both sides of his mouth, he's like, it was more serious and more forceful as he said, I don't think it's the type of thing that our society wants to do since we're trying to curb drinking and smoking cigarettes. And then when he announced that he wanted to legalize a few years or a couple years later, Ezra Levant played that clip over and over and over again. And I was like, he's got a point. He didn't give me any money or ask for my permission for the clip, but he had a point, right? And it made me realize, looking at you made me realize that whole job, and I guess I was basically an unregistered lobbyist in a lot of ways, because I worked for 4 or 5 months pressuring marijuana advocacy groups to pressure delegates to flip that vote from no to yes, from 30% to 70%. We got 78, I think. And then I realized later on that all of those things, I didn't want legalization to actually be rolled out where the government controlled it like the LCBO, because I thought that if you're going to turn a blind eye to dispensaries and then legalize and then shut the dispensaries down, that doesn't make any sense. There was already a market in place. How did this industry lose so many millions of dollars during the first couple of years?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that happen. First of all, this is what happens when corporations take over rather than relatively small time businesses and so forth. Is they got greedy, for one thing, and the other is that they grossly overestimated the market for cannabis. I think the mistake they made is they thought that cannabis was going to become the new alcohol, and any undergraduate student in epidemiology or marketing research would have easily accessed the data to show them that alcohol was used by about 78% of the population, and at that time, cannabis by about 15%. And we knew that they weren't going to be able to advertise the way alcohol is advertised so aggressively now. So there's no way that cannabis was going to quickly become the new alcohol. That just was not going to happen. But for whatever reason, they didn't see that. They also overestimated how easy it was going to be for foreign markets to develop for recreational cannabis. And as we know, that has not happened nearly as quickly as they assumed. So that was one problem, just that blunder. Then what they did is the executives of these big corporations were really incentivized in a way that killed them. They were incentivized for long-term growth. And by incentivized, I meant they would get bonuses based on long-term growth of the industry, not immediately getting product out to consumers. So their solution to that was to build and buy some of the biggest greenhouses that the world has ever seen. And most of them ended up sitting mostly empty and then being sold at enormous losses. And then, this industry was totally supported by enthusiastic investment, and these CEOs and executives were walking off as new multimillionaires while the companies were losing. I think Marijuana Business Daily put it at least $20 billion of investors' money was lost by these big $20 billion. I'm not making a mistake. It's not million, it's billion, $20 billion.
And I remember how livid, this is kind of funny in a way, but how livid weed smokers were when they found out that this surplus weed that they had cost too much to put in freezers and they didn't have the capacity. So they just destroyed it. They burned it. And listen, like, it's funny in a way, but then it's also like, that is the part of capitalism when you apply it to something like a recreational drug or alcohol, whatever, that doesn't make sense. It's something that, like, I don't even know how to, like, I get, it makes sense if you're like a die-in-the-wool capitalist, but to everybody else, it's like, what are you doing? Like, you're burning money in a sense. And I guess you don't want to be a socialist and spread the wealth or whatever, but There's got to be a way that you can make something like that work, create edibles or
Yeah.
something, export it to somewhere, like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not that
It,
smart, but
it was a disaster, and just to sort of put an exclamation point on that is that, again, Marijuana Business Daily, they reported that between 2018 and 2020, the industry actually incinerated more cannabis than it sold.
oh my God.
That's how badly they overestimated the market. And there was one company, I can't remember which one it was now, but one of them actually anticipating how much it was going to have to continue to incinerate. It actually bought its own incinerator rather than outsourcing the job.
Yeah.
That's how bad it was.
The rollout was so bad that, and I think a lot of people would have done this anyways, but the rollout was so bad that most of the people that I know that get that smoke weed on a regular basis, they get it from reserves. It's better quality. I know. Listen, I know it's black market, whatever you want to call it, but it's better quality. It's cheaper, and it doesn't require a box this big to get something that's that big, which I've never understood. I don't. I think that the way that, and the advertising. Sorry, I'm sort of being a scatterbrain right now, but
No, that's good.
my podcast. There's a local store here called Bay Bud, and I approached them when my show was still fairly young, like after 50 or whatever episodes, and asked him if he wanted to be like a sponsor for the show. And then he showed me the legislation that dictates how you can market cannabis, and I was like, this is crazy. There's no way to do it effectively unless you make fun of it. Unless you go like this: come to Bay Bud, we sell beep, and then also beep, and if you really want the best beep, and then you just have to do it like that because there's no way to do it properly. Why is it for most doctors and social workers and people like that, they will tell you alcohol has ruined millions and millions of families and people. There are very few cases where weed has done the same thing. Why the implication that it's a more harmful substance for you than alcohol in regards to marketing?
Right. Well, let me use one set of statistics to respond to that. Is there's a database here in Ontario that I helped to develop, and it keeps track of people who enter treatment programs for drug problems. And the most common by far is alcohol. On any given day in Ontario, there are 40,000 people in treatment for an alcohol problem in this province. Well, interestingly, guess what's second? This is going to surprise a lot of people. It's cannabis at 20,000 on any
Yeah, but
given
those are
day.
mostly from plea deals.
No, I looked into that. I mean, that's a fair response, and
Yeah.
I looked into that, and out of those 20,000, the most likely that would account for is 2,000 of those 20,000.
Okay.
So there
I
are
stand
this
corrected, yeah.
is a, you see, there's so many. I call them appetites of pleasure. Whether we're talking alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, whatever it is, gaming. There's a
Yeah.
certain portion of the population who will find a way to use it in a way that it's harmful. And it would be naive to think, because cannabis is a nice feeling, pleasurable drug, and there is a portion of the population who seem to have a problem with it. They get dependent on it. It's causing problems in their lives, and they can't stop. So they
Yeah,
go to a treatment program.
it's a mentally addictive drug. I know people that have an issue with weed. They're the people that wake up and the first thing they do is light a joint. I talked to a Rastafarian once, actually. He's like, weed is not supposed to be a substance that you use where your tolerance increases. You're supposed to use weed in a way where I know this is sounding weird, but coming from a Rasta, it just sounded legit for me. But he's like, you're only supposed to use it in a ritualistic way. And what he really meant by that, you don't have to be a Rasta or religious, but use it at the same time of day, once a day. So like when the kids go to bed, that's when you use it, and then your tolerance level will never increase.
Yeah.
Once you start day smoking, it all falls apart, I think, and your tolerance just keeps going up and up.
You raise a really interesting question. If we think about tobacco use in Indigenous populations, it was purely ceremonial for special occasions. It wasn't until we created, well, guess what? Big tobacco companies, corporations to commercialize it and promote it. That's when tobacco became a problem for our society. It's one of the things that I think we really need to think about is that it's not just about the intrinsic properties of the drug. It's about how we think about drugs
Yeah.
and how we're taught to think about it. I mean, I grew up in an era of constant tobacco and alcohol advertising, and I have a whole chapter in the book about that. And it's all about, what does alcohol and tobacco do for you? It makes you more popular, it makes you a better lover, it will improve your love life.
A
I mean,
better lover.
those were the messages that I grew up on with alcohol and tobacco, you know.
Yeah.
And I think this is what worries people about cannabis, is if we're not careful, cannabis can go down that same road. And it's got nothing to do with the drug cannabis, about how safe it is. It's got everything to do with how all the powers of marketing can influence the way a next generation will grow up thinking about it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that their marketing for weed is very juvenile, especially the edibles.
Mm.
And you know, and which causes a bunch of ancillary impacts, like kids thinking that they're eating candy and they're not. That's kind of a problem. But when I go to a dispensary, say in Toronto, and I'm like, by the way, I've lived out of Toronto for 6 years, so now I pronounce the second T. Sorry about that. But when I go to Toronto and I go to a dispensary, I'm looking at the edibles and I'm just like, am I 6? Like, why do I want a sour key? I never buy sour keys. I never like buy any of this candy shit. I want like a grown up edible. I want a Tic Tac or a Lodgins or something like that. And I want it to be like, you know, for the end of day comfort, you know, or something like that. Not like zany and wacky. I think the marketing kind of is a self-defeating proposition for them, where they're constantly aiming at younger generation.
Yes.
But once you look at Generation X and up, just enough with the candy already. We don't eat candy, most of us.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I'm not sure why. You know, anyway, so give me an idea then about whether or not you see hope for how the government is handling legalization now and into the next, say, decade.
Well, have you ever tried to get toothpaste back in the tube? it's,
Yes, but I was on high grade mushrooms at the time. So
good answer.
yeah.
I think it's going to be really difficult. And one of the best reports that I've read on cannabis legalization still was one that was produced in, I think, 2014 by a US organization called the RAND Corporation. And they really recommended that, we should not go from prohibition to big corporatized, commercialized cannabis, because you're never going to be able to undo it if you do, or at least it's going to be extremely difficult. Now, I think for Canada, what I would like to see, I'd be willing, I could support giving this a shot, is taking some of the concentration off these big cannabis factories and corporations and putting more focus on a network of smaller craft growers. And I think that would make everybody except the corporate people happy.
Yeah.
Public health people, health policy people would be more comfortable with it. Consumers would be more comfortable with it. I've talked to retailers, and I've talked to a guy who runs a testing lab, and they didn't even hesitate. They said, you know what, the craft grower stuff is far better quality than what's coming out of these big cannabis factories. So I think that is a reasonable solution for Canada. I'm not convinced that our current government is going to support that. In fact, they're toying with actually establishing an industry roundtable for cannabis to look at ways to promote this industry. So now they're hesitating on it. They're maybe losing enthusiasm for it. I don't know, but
it just sounds like a waste of time and money to me. Like really,
it's
really to educate themselves and to protect themselves from decisions they've already made, right? Like it's,
Well, and also to protect their investments, right? I mean, remember, these guys probably invested a lot of money in this industry, and they're losing their shirts because these big companies, their stocks are tanking. And so I think there's that element of it as well.
Is there an industry, or is it even legal? Because I honestly don't know, for consultants to help people grow their home weed?
I've never heard of such a thing. It was, thinking about it, as you mentioned, it would surprise me if it didn't exist, but
yeah. I mean, but
I don't know of it.
As Jody Emery used to like to point out, before weed was legalized, there were like 9 different types of charges that you could be charged with related to possession, and now there's 44. So there's There's a downside to all this. I mentioned magic mushrooms as a joke, but do you have any? Are you working on any additional books in the future for things like psilocybin?
Well, I've thought of it. I don't know if I have another book in me or not, maybe, but I do have a chapter in near the end of the book where I talk about, cannabis is the thin edge of the wedge. It's not the end of this. Is if you look at what we see with magic mushrooms, it's following exactly the same pattern that we saw within the early days of cannabis. And the thing that will pivot it is if we start getting a lot of politicians investing in those companies that are producing it for medical use, which is what happened with cannabis. Once we see the politicians invested in that industry, then we will see the political action to legalize it for recreational use. Once there is that financial incentive at the political level, will they do a better job than they did with cannabis? I'd be a bit skeptical. And it's not, I have anything against, I don't want people to go to jail for cannabis. I don't want them to be charged or arrested for mushrooms either, or for any drug. And I have that in the chapter too. I mean, I'm a strong supporter of decriminalization of all drugs. But because of what we've seen with our legal drug industries and now cannabis, I'm very nervous about legalization.
And to your earlier point regarding pharmaceutical companies, I have two things to say about that. One, I have been a recreational drug user for a lot of my life. I am now very much, I'm pretty much sober now. But the biggest problem that I had with any drug was a pharmaceutical drug. When I over medicated with my ADHD medication, I had to go to the hospital. Not for an OD, well, maybe it was sort of an OD thing, but I had to go and get my head right. You know what I mean? And that had never happened with any of the recreational drugs. Admittedly, I probably should have been a more moderate drug user my whole life, and that's water under the bridge now. But I am afraid that and I was talking to somebody about this earlier, about whether or not pharmaceutical companies already own the patent to the synthesization of psilocybin. And I hope that's not the direction that it goes. I really think that would be not only a huge mistake, but almost a criminal one and a gift to corporations once again when we don't need to go that route.
I think it would be high risk. I agree. And again, I do this in the last chapter of the book. I talk about, again, I go back to alcohol, tobacco, and pharmaceutical and say, here's what's happening these days. And one of the things that I think really concerns me is that there's a lot of people, executives from alcohol, tobacco, and pharma who are now investing in our big cannabis companies. So that concerns me as well. I mean, I think they will be more mature and better at making money, but I'm not sure that will be better for society as a whole because those industries don't have a good track record.
That's true. The book is called Buzzkill, The Corporatization of Cannabis. Michael, thank you very much for joining us on Blackballed today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, James. Thanks for asking me.
You have a good day. Pretty compelling stuff. I'll put the book up again just so you guys can go order it online. And it's called Buzzkill, The Corporatization of Cannabis. That's Michael R. DeVallaer, which is spelled DeVillaer. Just make the A silent. It's DeVallaer. Really compelling stuff. And I'm not saying that because I make a very brief appearance in the book, but he taught me a whole bunch of things about how my very small role in the what would you call it? The legalization process, I guess. Had all these things around it that I wasn't even aware of. And I asked him today on the phone, I'm like, was I a useful idiot or just a tool to sort of cushion certain people from being suspected as giving people an inside lane to investment? And he's like, the latter probably, but he's like, and then we both kind of wondered whether or not I should have registered as a lobbyist. I don't know if I didn't realize at the time that I might have been considered a lobbyist, but it was really interesting stuff. So please pick up the book. There are going to be a couple announcements that I'm making. I'm still doing Blackballed America, but I want my first guest to be a specific person, and I won't tell you who that is yet, so I'm waiting for schedules to become in sync. So until then, we will see you next time on Blackballed. Thanks, everybody.
Blackballed. Blackballed. Blackballed.